Distinguished guests, it is with great pleasure that I welcome you to our online briefing, which is part of a series of regular webinars where we discuss important topics related to nuclear arms control. My name is Claudia Crawford, and I head the Multilateral Dialogue of the Konrad-Adenauer-Foundation in Vienna. In this webinar series, we cooperate with atomic reporters. We witness the catastrophic invasion of Ukraine by Russia, which means that some 3 decades after the end of the Cold War, war has returned to Europe. In Europe, we had hoped that after the fall of the Iron Curtain, a new European peace order could be created that would be resilient in the long term. However, the post-Cold War European and international security architecture has been steadily eroding. This can be seen particularly clearly in the area of arms control. It is not yet foreseeable when and how the war in Ukraine will end. It may therefore be too early to talk about the future international security order. But we organizers think it is important to start thinking about how to restore a common security architecture for arms control measures to prevent an all-out arms race. I'm very glad to welcome our speakers, Rose Gottemöller, Oliver Meyer, and Ambassador Alexander Kment, and Tari Grauf from Atomic Reporter, who will be moderating our briefing and will introduce our speakers. Tari Grauf was formerly head of verification and security policy coordination at the International Atomic Energy Agency. I will pass the floor to Tari Grauf. Dear Tariq, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Claudia, for this introduction. And I also welcome our 3 speakers, Rose Gottemöller from California, Oliver Meyer from Berlin, and Alexander Kment from here in Vienna. As Claudia mentioned, some people have commented that perhaps it might be too early to talk about a new security architecture. But in this discussion, we will be talking about more general issues. We won't be talking about personalities. And I would also like to remind that, even before the Second World War ended, starting from 1942, there were already discussions on the setup of a future United Nations organization. And also, even before the end of the Second World War, institutions such as UNESCO, the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, and the World Bank, agreements on those were already signed. We've already also had war in Europe, but even then, arms control negotiations continued in some form during the Cold War. There was the invasion of Hungary in 1956, invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, but we still continued the negotiations on the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. There was a long war in Vietnam, but nonetheless, the United States and the Soviet Union agreed on the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty and their first Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty in the early 1970s. So we think that even though now, unfortunately, there's a catastrophic war going on here in the continent of Europe, nonetheless, we still should be looking at what happens after the war ends and how we might rescue some of the structure of arms control that has been carefully built up. So as Claudia mentioned, we are very fortunate to have 3 very competent speakers. Our first speaker will be Rose Gottemöller. She was Undersecretary for Arms Control and International Security, and as Assistant Secretary of State for Arms Control, Verification and Compliance at the United States State Department, was the chief negotiator of the New START Treaty. And you can see Rose's book behind my right shoulder, where she describes her experience in negotiating this very important treaty. After Rose, we will have Oliver Meyer. He is senior researcher at the Berlin office of the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy of the University of Hamburg, where he's also in charge of the trilateral German, Russian, United States Deep Cuts Commission. In the latest issue of Arms Control Today, the April issue, he has a very interesting article called Back to Basics, the Nuclear Order, Arms Control, and Europe. And then we will have Alexander Kement, Ambassador and Director for Disarmament, Arms Control, and Non-Proliferation at the Austrian Ministry for Foreign Affairs. And he's also the President Designate of the first conference of the states parties to the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. And you can also see his book behind my right shoulder in the green color on his experience in negotiating a multilateral treaty. So we are very fortunate today that we have one speaker who has experience in negotiating and bring into force a bilateral arms control treaty with specific numbers on warheads and delivery systems, and Alexander Kement that negotiated a multilateral framework treaty that hopefully will bring about further reductions and eventually an end to nuclear weapons, and Oliver Meyer providing a perspective in the current context. So with that, Rose, may I invite you for your comments?
Thank you very, very much, Tariq. And it's wonderful to be here with such a distinguished panel of colleagues. I very much look forward to our discussion. I wanted to really open with my concern about how are we going to deal with what I call a very large pariah state with nuclear weapons. It's one thing if we're dealing with DPRK, North Korea, with Kim Jong-un, largely cut off from the outside world, and a few tens of nuclear weapons, we believe. It's another thing to deal with the Russian Federation with 70 years of history building and developing nuclear warheads in their delivery system. We approximate that their number of warheads currently rests somewhere around 4,000 deployed and non-deployed, strategic and non-strategic warheads. Of course, among those, 1,550 are operationally deployed under the New START Treaty. So there continue to be in place the limits of the New START Treaty, which is very good. So far, I understand from colleagues in Washington that the Russians are implementing the New START Treaty, although because of the COVID pandemic, there are no on-site inspections going on now, but there are regular notifications flowing back and forth about changes in the status of the Russian strategic nuclear forces. If they go to a maintenance facility, for example, that kind of action would be notified. So we have a very good picture of the 24/7 status of the Russian strategic nuclear forces, thanks to the New START Treaty. And that kind of predictability is vital right now. I'll come back to that in just a moment, but I do want to stress once again that it is very difficult to foresee at the moment. And so I very much agree with introductory remarks by both Claudia and Tariq. It's very hard to foresee at the moment. How do we get back to the negotiating table with the Russian Federation? I've written in Foreign Affairs, and I believe it 100%, that the Russian Federation has had a very proud history of contributing in positive and creative ways to both the Non-Proliferation Treaty regime and to the history of strategic nuclear arms control, beginning in 1972 with the first Strategic Arms Limitation Agreement. We now, the United States and USSR, now Russian Federation, have a 50-year history of limiting and controlling and reducing strategic nuclear force posture. So my view is, of course, that that process must continue. But with the view out there that President Putin is a war criminal, President Biden himself has said that publicly, and the Kremlin has shot back that those remarks are unwarranted and unforgivable. So at the moment, with the two presidents not being willing, I would say, to talk to each other, how do we think about resuming discussions on the strategic stability front and toward continuing use and control strategic nuclear force posture in replacing the New START Treaty, which goes out of force in 2026. So it's a particularly difficult moment. I don't think now that anyone should to try to get back to the negotiating table on strategic stability and nuclear arms control. The first and top objective and priority must be a stable peace deal between Ukraine and Russia, getting Russian forces out of Ukraine, stopping the slaughter there, stopping the violence. That needs to be the top international objective right now. And I very, very much agree with that. But we do need to think ahead about how we get back to the negotiating table eventually with the Russians. resuming strategic stability talks and working to replace the New START treaty. Here I will say, my view is that before this current crisis in Ukraine, the sides were I would say, well drawn up. The Russians and the Americans basically knew what their top issues were going to be in the replacement negotiations for New START, and finding the trade space between those positions was going to be the important, I would say, preparatory work that would have to be done before actual negotiations on a replacement for New START could begin. Top priorities for the United States to control the so-called exotic delivery systems that President Putin announced in March of 2018. They include the air-launched ballistic missile, the Kinjal, a couple of sea-launched systems. I will note that the Avant-Garde hypersonic glide vehicle, which was one of the systems he announced in March of 18, the Russians have already said that it will by definition fall under the limitations of the New START treaty. They have also said that about the Sarmat, which was yesterday tested with a great deal of fanfare, but by definition, as an intercontinental ballistic missile, the Sarmat, a heavy ICBM, will also fall under the constraints of the New START treaty and presumably its follow-on treaty. So we're looking at the air-launched Kinjal, we're looking at the naval systems, getting controls on those delivery systems that are so-called exotic, and then second, getting controls on all warheads, deployed and non-deployed, strategic, those meant for strategic delivery, and those meant for non-strategic delivery systems. Those are the top priorities for the Americans. The Russians have stressed once again their resolve to get a handle on, control US conventionally armed weapons having strategic effect, so-called prompt global strike systems, and also clearly they are always interested in constraining US missile defenses. The last thing I'll say about this priority of the Russians, however, is that the Russians themselves are now deploying very capable national missile defenses, increasingly so with the deployment of their so-called S-500 system, which is very capable against intercontinental ballistic missiles. And I think for that reason, I've been advising Washington that if there is a discussion of limiting missile defenses, it can't be all about US missile defenses. It also has to be about these new and very capable Russian missile defense systems, such as the S-500. Perhaps I will leave it there, Tarek. There's so much that can be said about nuclear saber rattling and what's been going on very recently in the context of the crisis, but I'll leave that for our discussion period. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Rose. Those were really very sober and important comments. I'm glad to hear that at least the data exchange under the New START is continuing, even though the on-site inspections are not continuing. But every 6 months, the State Department puts up the data. So the last data I found was from September last year. So to your knowledge, has the April data of the two sides been put up yet, or have you seen it in a public space?
I haven't seen it. Perhaps I'll check online, but I haven't seen it yet. I do expect that data exchange to take place. I don't expect there to be any limit. And by the way, under those data exchanges in recent times, both the United States and Russian Federation are under the START treaty, that is 700 deployed delivery vehicles and 1,550 deployed warheads. So the numbers have been lower than allowed by the New START treaty.
Good, thank you. Oliver, over to you.
Good afternoon from Berlin, and thanks for inviting me, Tariq. It's a challenge, of course, to speak on European perspectives on arms control after the war against Ukraine, and it's also a little bit intimidating to speak in the middle between Rose and Alexander. As you said, I'm speaking from Berlin as a researcher at the Institute for Peace Research and Security Policy in Hamburg, and also as one of the coordinators of the Deep Cuts Commission, which is a trilateral group of arms control experts from Russia, the United States, and Germany. As a group, we have no position yet on the implications of Russia's attack against Ukraine for arms control. But what I can say is based on discussions we've had within the group and bilaterally, of course, with members of the Deep Cuts Commission, which has been discussing these issues for some 8 years now. The obvious caveat up front is that how Putin's war against Ukraine will end and when it will end will have serious implications for any scenario for European security and arms control in it. Many things we don't know yet. What weapons might still be used? Will we see an even wider use of weapons that have been banned, such as cluster munitions, incendiary weapons? Might Russia even use chemical weapons or other weapons of mass destruction? Might third countries join the war, Belarus, for example? And at what point might one or both parties lose hope of making gains on the battlefield and become ready to engage seriously in peace negotiations? None of these questions can be answered right now, but all of them, I think, will have very deep implications for the security architecture in Europe and the role of arms control in it. As you said, Tariq, the motto will be back to basics, I think, as I wrote in Arms Control Today for arms control in Europe, particularly. Let me briefly offer three very brief observations and three recommendations. The first observation for Europe, obviously, is that the war against Ukraine is increasing the divisions in Europe. We will have more clearly two opposing blocs in Europe, but these blocs, in contrast to the Cold War, will be more unequal. The attractiveness of the EU and NATO is growing. We see moves to join NATO in Finland and in Sweden. At the same time, Russia is likely to come out of this war much weaker than it entered into the war. This imbalance in military, political, and economic capabilities will likely make arms control more difficult. It will make it, on the one hand, necessary to compartmentalize a little bit arms control. Rose spoke about this. At the same time, we need these kind of trade-offs between different topics to make progress, and that's a dilemma I think that we will have to tackle in the future. Conventional arms control in particularly will be very difficult, I think. A lot of investments in defense capabilities in the West, including in Germany, during periods of an arms buildup, and that will be for the coming years, I presume, because these programs have a long half-life. It is, of course, very difficult to agree on any kind of conventional arms control. And a third observation, obviously, nuclear and conventional risk reduction will become more important in such a world. The focus is moving back to bombs, less to novel types of unconventional warfare that many of us focused on before the war broke out. Now we see tanks rolling across Europe again, and at the same time, the salience of nuclear weapons is increasing through Russian actions, Russian attempts to use nuclear threats to influence Western politics on Ukraine. So that's three observations I would like to offer very briefly, three recommendations, 3 points one can make. The first one, building on the risk reduction theme. This is really going back to basics. As I said, the core purpose of nuclear arms control was to reduce risks of nuclear war, and that I think will be at the forefront. Again, secondary functions, reducing defense expenditures, reducing suffering, human suffering during conflict will take the backstage. Again, Alexander will speak on the humanitarian dimension here, but I think the focus will be really on reducing risks of nuclear war. Particularly, the good news is that we had a dialogue on risk reduction among the P5 even before the war, and that might actually be a good forum to continue these discussions because of the hostile relations between NATO and Russia. But such risk reduction measures, I think, will have to be tangible, verifiable, and reciprocal, I think, because frankly, nobody is going to believe any Russian promises or policy statements on nuclear policy issues for the time being. On the conventional side, as Rose has mentioned, the immediate and most important challenge will be to find ways to monitor and secure a possible ceasefire and maybe even peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia. We do have a toolbox there where some of the tools may be appropriate to use, including the Dayton Accords and other conventional arms control accords that were agreed after wars that took place. But it would be very difficult to find the right mix of instruments here and also security guarantees and the appropriate institutional setting for such an agreement, because I think both the OSCE and also the NATO-Russia framework are very difficult for obvious reasons to be used. On the second point I would like to make is on the increased salience of nuclear weapons and declaratory policies. And we should think hard about possibilities to slow or maybe even reverse the trend towards increased salience of nuclear weapons. This, for the time being, is an issue primarily for NATO, which is discussing right now the new strategic concept, and the role of nuclear weapons in NATO's deterrence and defense postures will be agreed in June at the summit in Spain. And in this context, I think it's useful to take a very sober look at the usefulness of nuclear weapons in Russia's war against Ukraine. Jeffrey Knopfest recently published a very good piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, which takes stock of the role of nuclear weapons. And he makes the argument, which I agree with, that Putin's unprecedented attempts to prevent the West from supporting Ukraine by making nuclear threats has been surprisingly unsuccessful. The West was not intimidated to the degree that Russia may have hoped for, and supports Ukraine in a number of ways. By contrast, and I can say that as somebody who has not been uncritical of NATO's nuclear policy in the past, the alliance has been, I think, attempting to lower the nuclear temperature. We have seen some moves to demonstrate resolve here in, for example, increased number of French nuclear submarines at sea, also more patrols by US strategic bombers, but very little of the rhetorical posturing that we've seen from Russia. And I would argue that there's no need to change such a policy. NATO, for example, I think should stick to its policy of not deploying new nuclear-capable INF range missiles in Europe. And even though the US nuclear posture review, from everything we hear, is not going to move in the direction of a sole purpose, let alone no first use policy, I think NATO, at the very least, should not increase the role of nuclear weapons in its deterrence and defense posture. Final recommendation, and to zoom out very briefly on the global picture, one unfortunate effect of this war is going to be that our perspective on non-proliferation and disarmament is going to be even more Eurocentric than it was before the war. Given the deadlock that we are going to see on arms control in Europe, preserving at least some degree of cooperation and non-proliferation will become even more important. We had such a tacit agreement, at least during the Cold War, and it will be very important, I think, to try to establish that consensus to preserve islands of cooperation, as I write in the article. And one small glimmer of hope is the continued attempt to save the Iran nuclear deal with Russian support. We can only hope that this will be successful. Unfortunately, other global regimes, particularly on chemical and biological weapons, Russia has dragged into this conflict. That is very worrying. If it's not possible to bring Russia back into the mainstream, we have to think creatively about ways to isolate Russia in these regimes. This goes to the question that Rose initially addressed: how do we deal with a rogue state that is a permanent member of the Security Council? Very, very difficult. I would argue that the framework that is also used by the German Foreign Ministry, for example, that this is a conflict between liberal democracies and autocracies, is not very useful from that perspective, because many of the countries that we do not want to support Russia are not really liberal democracies. And therefore, this may not be a good framework to make the case that these multilateral regimes are really about common goods and that we should preserve them for their own good. So to close, let me just say that, of course, Russia is a revisionist power in Europe, and that as long as Putin remains in power, it will be impossible to build a European security architecture with Russia as a partner. That's an obvious point to make. Arms control can help us to manage relations with such a Russia. And in the meantime, and I say that also as a deep cuts coordinator, it is very important that we maintain civil society relations with Russia. It's bad enough that Russia is putting so much pressure on our Russian colleagues, is trying to cut off these relations. We in the West should try everything we can to maintain channels open, even if that is sometimes difficult and sometimes even uncomfortable in these circumstances. Thanks very much, Tarek.
Thank you, Oliver. Those were very interesting and useful comments from a European perspective. You mentioned that a new NATO strategic concept will be on the table at the June summit in Madrid. From what you can discern, do you think that the role of nuclear weapons in the strategic concept would be increased, or how might nuclear weapons be dealt with in the strategic concept?
To be honest, I have very little insight. There's not much transparency in discussions on the new strategic concept, much less transparency, I think, than 12 years ago when the last strategic concept was agreed. Unfortunately, my hunch is that there are pressures to increase reliance on nuclear weapons. Obviously, very few opportunities to reduce the role of nuclear weapons, that the kind of sober assessment that would be called for is unlikely to take place. But at the very least, I hope that some of the principles that have been announced up till now, no new deployments, and maybe also no move in the direction of closer integration of conventional and nuclear deterrence, are going to be thought again in light of how Russia is going to come out of this war. Thanks very much.
Okay, thank you. So before I invite Alexander, I might mention that we are seeing some chats and some questions in the Q&A. We will monitor them, and after Alexander has spoken, we will have a moderated discussion based on your comments and your questions. Alexander, over to you now.
Many thanks. Thank you very much for inviting me to this discussion. I want to stress I speak in my personal capacity, and very good comments from Rose and Oliver, and I find it not very difficult to add to what they have said. I agree very much that the focus at the moment, of course, must be to bring this terrible conflict to an end. I also agree with the points made by Oliver, well, with all the points really, so I can't list them all. I was asked to speak specifically on the impact of the Ukraine conflict on deterrence and the humanitarian aspects of nuclear weapons and on the future discourse around these issues, and also on the TPNW first meeting of states parties and the 2022 NPT review conference. So I'll try to make a few points along those lines. I think as far as the impact is concerned, and I think the two speakers before me also made the point, it's very difficult to say at that moment. I think the honest answer must be we don't know, because it depends very much on how this conflict will unfold, how it ends, hopefully. And of course, very many scenarios are possible, including some very bad ones. But it's also possible that we may end up with a positive dynamic, which doesn't really look very obvious at the moment, but we shouldn't rule it out. So I think the fact that Europe needs to increase its defensive capabilities was already a consensus before that war started. I think that was absolutely clear. What we're seeing now, of course, is a heightened threat perception in Europe. But I would argue that if this leads to a sort of nuclear salience reflex, that would be a mistake for a variety of reasons. But I would also say that it's also something related to the identity of the European Union as a peace project. So if the Russian invasion leads to a strong, even emotional reflex with respect to nuclear deterrence, I think that is at the moment fully understandable. But the key question must be about security, the central question that needs to be discussed: to what extent do nuclear weapons really provide security and stability for Europe that justify the enormous risks that the existence of these weapons bring, specifically in Europe. And there I would, of course, make the point that it's important to bring in the perspective on humanitarian consequences and risks and everything that is known about this. The fact that any use of these weapons, specifically in Europe, would have catastrophic humanitarian consequences, and even strongest proponents of nuclear deterrence are now concerned about new risk drivers such as new technologies. So we all know that it is a very fragile and precarious concept. So that's the key question that we have to ask. And I think there it would be important, when we talk about nuclear weapons in Europe, to take the abstraction out of the debate and really talk about in which scenarios it would be acceptable for Europe to actually use these weapons or have them used by someone else on their behalf. I think that is the discussion about nuclear deterrence often remains in the abstract. And I think it is very important to change this and talk about it in very concrete terms. We have seen, I believe that what we have seen in the Ukraine conflict, the nuclear threats that have been made, raise a number of very important questions about nuclear deterrence and also about the legitimacy of it. We see Russia using the threat essentially to try to prevent NATO to come to the aid of Ukraine, so as to be able to wage a catastrophic conventional war undisturbed, which of course is completely contrary to the concept of nuclear deterrence, as was pointed out before. That has not been very effective because, of course, the West has come to the aid of Ukraine in a very clear way. Of course, there could be more, but the West was certainly not deterred by these threats. I also agree that the response from NATO on the nuclear rhetoric by Russia was very restrained, which is very good. But at the same time, NATO and the West is trying to build the most comprehensive non-nuclear deterrence package that we've ever seen in terms of economic measures and also international condemnation, which of course is difficult and it may take time to be effective. So it is also interesting that in response to the nuclear threat, at least we see non-nuclear deterrence approaches as a focus, which I think is important. At the same time, it's also clear and has been pointed out by many experts that the US, of course, is extremely concerned to get involved in the direct potential nuclear confrontation with Russia, which of course may also raise questions about extended deterrence. So there are many issues in play at the moment, and I think it's important to have a very honest discussion about this. I think the population in Europe would also have to understand more clearly that by increasing the salience of nuclear weapons, it also increases the fact of being a target for nuclear weapons if nuclear deterrence fails. And I would also say that an increasing focus on nuclear weapons in Europe has an important impact on the nuclear regime more globally. Because if the answer of Europe to Russia's action is a stronger focus on nuclear weapons, it will be seen by the rest of the world as a call for proliferation, which of course has potentially very negative implications for the nuclear regime that is under very big stress anyway. And it also has a very negative impact on the role that the EU seeks for itself as a promoter of multilateralism. I think that's an aspect that also needs to be discussed and considered. I think what we see, we are in the middle of this war, of this crisis. There is, of course, people are scared and there is a very emotional reaction. But I think it is important to have a sober discussion, as Oliver said, about the actual security gain from nuclear weapons as against the catastrophic consequences and risks that they bring. So what we have in us in the nuclear bubble, we've always known that this is a very important issue, but we have struggled with the fact that the vast majority of the population didn't take much attention, certainly in Europe has thought that this is an issue of the past. I think that has changed. It's come back with a vengeance. So we see, of course, the discussion, people are scared of Russia and we need to be concerned about security, and all of this is understandable, but it is also potentially leading to a much broader societal discourse about these weapons that hasn't happened in Europe since the 1980s. So that may come back. So we will probably see very strong pro and very strong contra arguments about nuclear weapons. So it is very hard to speculate how this goes. I think right now, obviously, we see a stronger emphasis on these weapons. So I think my answer to the first question is probably more questions rather than answers, because it is extremely difficult. I think it can go very many different ways. I'm of course concerned that by some of the discussion that we see at the moment with a stronger focus on these weapons. I think it is a mistake. On the prospects, the second aspect, the prospects for the TPNW and the prospects for the NPT REFCON. I think I'm starting with the NPT. I think the NPT has been profoundly damaged by what we have seen now. But that, of course, comes on top of 2.5 decades or even longer, where the NPT has been in trouble, certainly on the disarmament front. And it comes also on top of 2.5 decades of rather a dismantling of the nuclear regime than a strengthening of it. But the fact that a nuclear weapon state uses the threat of nuclear weapons to wage war against a non-nuclear weapon state in good standing with the NPT is a profound, it turns the NPT completely on its head. It's a profound challenge to the NPT. It profoundly damages the notion that, broadly speaking, the N5 are working together within the NPT context. I think the P5 process is in very deep trouble. Of course, I hope that there will still be areas where cooperation is possible, but what we've seen in Ukraine coming a few weeks after the joint P5 statement is, of course, terrible. And it was supposed to be a key deliverable for the NPT, and that has now lost a lot of credibility on top of all the problems that the NPT already had. I just want to repeat the point that if the answer to what we see now is a stronger focus on nuclear weapons, the damage for the NPT will be extreme and potentially terminal for the NPT. On the TPNW, I think this is something that obviously I'm thinking about a great deal at the moment. Certainly in Europe, the context for the TPNW is more difficult now, or even more difficult than it already was. On the other hand, the point I made before on the broader debate, I think is of course an opportunity to make the profound arguments on which this treaty is based around the humanitarian consequences and risks. And that is something, that is a type of discussion that is not necessarily a security expert level discussion, but something that can connect to broader public. So it will be an opportunity to make these points. And I think globally, specifically given the very negative prospect for the NPT, globally, I think states that want to take a stand against nuclear weapon and in support of nuclear disarmament will probably rally more around the TPNW. So we may see, not in Europe or not immediately in Europe, but globally, it is at least possible that we see more support for the TPNW. So it is a very complex picture on all fronts. I think the best thing that we can do is to admit that we don't really know, that we all have to act very responsibly, because all of us have an interest that this regime that has been painstakingly built over many decades is not a complete collateral damage of the developments that we see, and rather that constructive states try to work together as much as possible and wherever possible. I think I'll leave it there, Tariq. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alexander, and especially for commenting on the upcoming TPNW conference in June, and also the NPT review conference, much delayed due to COVID, scheduled for August. So let me ask you a question more on the NPT. As you mentioned already, many non-nuclear weapon states felt that the pace of nuclear disarmament was not as much as they expected, even though, as Rose and others have pointed out, that at least among the two largest possessors of nuclear weapons, they have reduced by about 80% or so, and are much below the Cold War heights. And as Rose mentioned, under the New START Treaty, they are limited to 1,550 deployed warheads. And according to the data, both of them are somewhat below those limits. But despite that, what added problems do you see for the nuclear disarmament discussion in the NPT, particularly with regard to the role of nuclear weapons, and also Security Council Resolution 255 of 1968 provided positive security assurances to non-nuclear weapon states of the weapon states in the Security Council coming to the aid of a non-nuclear weapon state attacked by a nuclear weapon state. And then we have Resolution 984 of 1995 on negative security assurances. So both of those resolutions, or the efficacy of those, are now called into question with this attack by a weapon state against a non-weapon state, as you mentioned. So what effect do you see also on, in a sense, the security considerations of non-nuclear weapon states with regard to the weapon states?
That's a very difficult question, and a lot in it. I agree, of course, and of course, we and everybody else welcome the reductions on nuclear weapons that have taken place. But even though much of it has been because of obsolescence, but the key issue, and I think where nuclear disarmament, where probably the division on the debate on nuclear disarmament lies, is what it actually is supposed to mean. And I would argue that the vast majority of non-nuclear weapon states would like to see a credible move away from reliance on these weapons. And that is simply not in place. We have the NPT is now over 50 years old, and there is no credible path and no timeline, no perspective has been provided how that would be achieved. And I think that is the reason for the credibility problem of the NPT as it comes to Article 6. I think for now, for that review conference and for the context in which we are, I think the vast majority of states that simply want these multilateral treaties to function, the focus will be to try to safeguard as much as possible them falling apart. So to not see a complete rollback of positive steps that have been agreed in the past, and go back to basics, rally around the multilateral principle, I think is important. But at the end of the day, it's the lack of perspective and the lack of credibility around how nuclear disarmament is to be achieved, other than an objective put out there in a far distant future for a security environment that nobody really knows how to get there. I think the point is that we need to make progress on nuclear disarmament in the security environment that we have, rather than frame nuclear disarmament as something to be achieved in a far distant future. I think that is probably where many non-nuclear weapon states stand. On the issue of security assurances, I think that has been also profoundly damaged. We have seen also over the years on many nuclear weapon-free zones that protocols have not been ratified. We have now seen the Budapest Memorandum being completely torn apart. So the whole concept of security assurances, I think, has unfortunately also suffered a great deal from what we've seen.
Thank you. So we have a number of questions and comments coming in, but before that, I'd like to offer an opportunity to both Rose and Oliver to make any additional comments or comment on what the others have said. Rose, would you like to add some more comments?
Well, I think a key issue as we're running up to the NPT review conference, I mentioned this during my remarks, is the fact that we do have this blandishment of nuclear weapons going on by precisely Vladimir Putin, the president of the Russian Federation. So for those in the multilateral community who are really pushing and beating on the drum that we need to make progress here, you must confront the problem of how do we deal with the president of the Russian Federation creating this kind of glamour around nuclear weapons again. And I think it's up to us to stand firm, of course, that they are unusable. They are not glamorous. They are not an element of political power that anyone should wrap themselves in. And I do think that this is an appeal that can be made to China, because I don't believe that China is falling prey to this same notion of rattling the nuclear saber or brandishing nuclear weapons in order to, in some ways, bolster the power of the Kremlin at this moment of its evident weakness, failure of its conventional force operations. on the one hand, and on the other hand, and Alexander and Oliver both commented on this, it has underscored a kind of deterrence of US and NATO involvement directly in the war in Ukraine, although I want to also express my view of the limitations of that argument, because the United States and NATO alliance have always been very clear that the so-called Article 5 commitment of the Washington Treaty, the founding document of NATO, that is the security guarantee, is for NATO member states. Ukraine is a partner of NATO, but not a NATO member state. So at this moment, the objective of NATO on a strategic level should be to prevent this war from spreading to NATO member states and turning into a hot war in all of NATO Europe. So I do think that that is an important point also to bear in mind as we confront these arguments and grapple with them. I do want to say, as I end this set of my remarks, that I do think it's important that we be reaching out to China. I was very glad to see yesterday that General Austin, the Secretary of Defense of the United States, finally was able to talk to his Chinese counterpart. I think that, I don't know what was discussed there, but I think it's a good step that that conversation took place. And I think it is very important now for the United States and the rest of the P5, if Russia's not going to play, I don't know how they're going to play in the RevCon, but if they're not going to play in the P5, then China, UK, France, and the United States, I do believe, should work as hard as they can to ensure that the RevCon does not fail utterly and that it is able to bolster the continuing strength of the NPT moving forward. So again, I'm waiting to see how China is going to react and respond to the crisis in this context of arms control diplomacy, but they've always been strong supporters of multilateral regimes, including the NPT. So I am hopeful that they will be willing to step up to this task.
Thank you, Rose. I think those are very important comments. And the president-designate of the NPT Review Conference, Gustavo Slavanen, will be here next week, and I will summarize some of your comments to him. Oliver, did you want to add something more?
Yeah, just very briefly to maybe expand on what Rose just said. I think even looking beyond the nuclear issues, the question will be how to deal in many multilateral arms control regimes. Many of them emerged in the 1990s, including NPT extension, CWC, CTBT. How to work around Russia, which is trying to exploit also its position as a permanent member of the Security Council to strengthen its position. That's a new challenge. I think we have not had a permanent member of the Security Council so obviously opposed to some of these agreements. I look a little bit into the chemical weapons issues, for example. I think there's a role here for the United Nations to build the international consensus against Russia's obstructionism. The UN General Assembly resolution that we saw had a very strong uniting element in it against Russia's attack on Ukraine, surprising to many, but I think that's a good basis to build on. China obviously is key here, and as I absolutely agree with Rose that there are many issues where China cannot be very interested in following Russia's course in the multilateral issues here, and that includes some of the humanitarian issues, landmines, cluster munitions, where China is to some degree engaged on. Also, I'm not sure that China, even though it has voted with Russia on chemical weapons, really is interested in the CWC falling apart. So there may be opportunities here. Of course, it would help if the United States would also become more engaged on humanitarian arms control, including some of these treaties that I mentioned, which the United States has not joined. There was a very positive development that the United States a couple of days ago announced that it would unilaterally refrain from anti-satellite tests this is the kind of norm-setting exercise that I think that we need right now to build international coalitions to isolate Russia and the few countries that are still trying to hold Russia's back. Thanks very much.
Okay, so we have some questions that I will put to you, and then you can decide who wants to answer. The first is on the United Nations, and picking up what you said, Oliver, the resolutions in the General Assembly were in the 11th special session of the General Assembly, convened when the Security Council is deadlocked on an important issue, and particularly if one of the 5 permanent members have vetoed it. And so that was the resolution that got 141 votes condemning the Russian invasion. But there's also the concept of the Uniting for Peace resolution, which enabled UN forces led by the US to intervene in the Korean conflict starting in 1950. So a question from Senator Douglas Roach of Canada, former ambassador for disarmament. He's mentioned that UN Secretary General Guterres is now seeking to go to Moscow and Kiev to talk to the 2 presidents. So his question is, in your view, what should the UN be doing to strengthen this intervention and to try and bring about a cessation of hostilities and a ceasefire and lay the ground for some discussion on how to resolve this this question? So which of among the 3 who would like to respond to Senator Roach? Oliver?
Well, perhaps
Yeah.
I'll start.
Okay, please, Rose.
Oh, I'm sorry, Oliver, go ahead. You go ahead, because
No, I wasn't volunteering, but I can try. I mean, I think at this stage, the role of the United Nations in intervening and trying to bring the parties to the table is going to be very difficult. While the war is still unfolding and both sides hope to make gains on the ground, historically, it's been very difficult to have this kind of mediating role. I'm very pessimistic. I think what he can do is offer us good services and should offer us good services if and when negotiations resume, to either facilitate such talks and also, if desired, to provide the capacities to monitor a possible ceasefire agreement. But frankly, I think, as I said before, the main role of the United Nations, generally speaking, right now is to oppose the aggression and to build international consensus around that question. And that kind of is a tension, of course, with any kind of trying to mediate here. Let me stop there, maybe.
So Rose, in addition to your comments on the UN, I'll also put a question to you that came from Ambassador Carlo Trezza from Rome. And his question is, what about Foreign Minister Lavrov's suggestion to base a resumed dialogue on the basis of the 1999 arrangement on indivisibility of security?
Well, first, I just wanted to say hello to friends and colleagues like Doug Roach, and very nice that you are on today, Doug. So good to hear from you. My answer was very similar to the one that Oliver gave regarding the role of the United Nations. I think in facilitating right now, perhaps being a kind of communication link between the 2 sides that would have some, in some ways, plausible deniability, I assume, but also being at a high level. So there's something to be said for that. It would be a question as to, the level of trust both sides would have in the UN and how they would be willing to make use of that mechanism. But I think the offer is an important one, and I'm glad Secretary General Guterres has agreed to open up that line of communication. So we will see what happens. Their role in possibly observing a peace process, of course, would also be very, very important and involve a larger international community potentially than the OSCE monitoring missions that took place in the context of the so-called Minsk process. On your other question, Tarek, I'm sorry, please repeat.
Yeah, so this was from Carlo Trezza, and he wanted to know, he referenced proposal by Sergei Lavrov.
Right. Okay. Ambassador, thank you for that question. You know, that offer is very much on the table in the context of these two agreements that the Russians slapped down at the end of 2021 very publicly. I was very disturbed by this megaphone diplomacy that they were conducting at the end of 2021, insisting that everything had to be taking place publicly, including putting those, leaking those two proposals to the press through El País in Madrid. It was a very disturbing display, given that the Russians are such good diplomats. Normally, you know, they are very, very circumspect and keep their cards very close to their chest. So I knew something bad was going on even at the time. But that said, at the time, the United States and the NATO alliance took a very hard and a very strong look at what would be available from those two draft proposals that the Russians made to work with. And in January, again, in an attempt to stop this juggernaut of an invasion going forward, the United States and NATO made a good faith effort to say, this is the foundation we are able to pull out of the agreements. Some of these proposals you're making are totally unacceptable. For example, that NATO should no longer as an option have that part of the Washington Treaty essentially shut down. And so some things were completely unacceptable. But the United States and NATO made a good faith effort to say there are parts of what you have offered here that we are willing to work on. And by the way, as far as I understand it, they were willing to begin to work on establishing some new constraints on intermediate range ground launched missile systems, starting with the proposal that Putin made on a moratorium on such missiles in Europe from October of 2022. So I'm sorry, 2021. So to make a long story short, I do think what the Russians had to offer up in December of last year had some positive aspects to it. As I understand it, they were the basis for negotiations. Some of those aspects, as far as NATO and the US was concerned, I don't know what will happen now let's just assume a peace process gets going, whether the United States and NATO would be willing to return to those proposals. But certainly there was a foundation there from what the Russians had to offer up at that time. But it was not the 1999, you know, indivisibility of security proposal in some.
Thank you, Rose. We have a question from Yuri Krivonos. He was recently the head of the UN Regional Center for Peace and Disarmament for Asia Pacific. And I'll put this to Alexander. He's referring to the confidence and security building measures that was one of the most important outcomes of the Helsinki process and served as a basis for further arms control and disarmament in the conventional and nuclear area in Europe. And his question is, do you believe that this process could be restored when the war in Ukraine is over? And if so, how could this be done or modified?
I think I'm struggling with an answer to that question, to be honest. I wanted to first come back to the UNSG efforts to offer his good services. I think this is extremely important. Who are the voices that have this impartiality and credibility? So even though the prospects at the moment, the signs that there is any space for negotiations may still be very slim, it's extremely important that he's trying, and I think we should all support him fully. I'm happy to pass on the CBM question. It seems very difficult at the moment to envisage, but of course it will be essential to get back into that modus. But I have no good answer on this question. Please, Rose, you have maybe a lot more experience on this than I do. I'm passing this question.
Rose, would you like to add something?
Yeah, the point made by the questioner is that confidence and security building measures are often a prelude to then actual arms reduction and control measures. So I think that is a very important point to make right now. And resuming some kind of confidence building and predictability activities, I hope will be possible. It doesn't look possible at this moment, but I hope it will be possible before too much time has gone by as we are again implementing a peace process in Ukraine. And by the way, my personal view is that we should not return to the table with the Russians on arms control, confidence building, and transparency discussions, including the European security architecture, until the peace process is well underway. For me, that means Russian troops are withdrawn from Ukrainian territory, not to the status quo ante of February 23rd, but back to their operating bases. Second, that there should be a reconstruction process underway in Ukraine, and the prelude to all that, the predicate to it, of course, must be a stable ceasefire. So those are basic conditions from my point of view. But I do think in an early phase, to get back to the table, it will be important to wrestle with the confidence and security building measures, predictability measures as a first order of business.
Thank you. And in that answer, Rose, you also answered a question from Jackie Cabasso, which was the status of US-Russian strategic dialogue, and is it completely dead? And I think in this comment and in your original comments, you sort of addressed that particular question.
Yes, I don't believe, by no means, and Jackie, I saw your question earlier, I don't believe they are dead at all. The United States has paused them. The Russians say they're ready to go now. I do think that's a kind of propagandistic move at the moment, because the United States was the one who paused the strategic stability discussions. And so the Russians, of course, grabbing at the moral high ground, say they're ready to continue now. But again, with the violence and the destruction in Ukraine, and as we see evidence of war crimes accumulating, it is just not the moment right now to be engaging in bilateral talks in any sphere, I think, except where we are doing our best to continue to try to move toward a peace process in Ukraine.
Oliver, I'll come to you next, since we asked you to speak on the European, from European perspectives, and also in connection with your article in Arms Controls Today. Under the Conventional Forces in Europe Treaty, there were limits imposed on 7 categories of conventional weapons that could be used to seize and hold territory. But then the CFE Treaty limits fell by the wayside once Russia started moving out of them. But can you foresee some return to a CFE modified, and further limits on these categories of weapons, attack helicopters, main battle tanks, artillery pieces, and so on, in the Central European space, so that we cannot have a repeat of the Ukrainian invasion in the future, so to speak, if the weapons are not there or they're deployed further away?
Frankly, I'm very skeptical about that at the time. We're going to see an increase in conventional weapons across the board. Germany has just committed an extra 100 billion euros to defense expenditure and pledged to keep the 2% spending of, under NATO commitments. Other countries will increase. Ukraine will have to rely on conventional deterrence much more strongly. So I find it difficult to imagine a future where this type of CFE agreement across the board in Europe will happen anytime soon. The best we can hope for maybe are sub-regional agreements building around a possible ceasefire agreement, which will have to include some kind of deconflicting measures, probably more serious, better monitored, and with stronger enforcement mechanisms than we saw under the Minsk agreement. That could be, being very optimistic, a kind of stepping stone for additional agreements on other regions. But the problem, of course, is that Russia will come out of this war, I think, also militarily weaker than it was before. So it will have a hard time accepting such limits. It has to rely on risk-taking, probably even more than in the past, because it's lacking the military and economic capacities to counter what it perceives as threats from NATO. All of these trends run counter to the type of agreement we had in the early 1990s, which only became possible at a rare moment in time after the end of the Cold War. We are moving in the opposite direction, unfortunately, today. So I hate to be pessimistic. I usually try not to be, but on this issue, I find it hard to imagine a future where such type of conventional arms control can play a role. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. Rose, I'll come back to you. You mentioned the Article 5 commitment to NATO, but there are other countries that also have defense arrangements with the US that are underpinned with a nuclear or extended deterrence, such as Japan and South Korea. What messages do you think that the South Koreans and Japanese are taking from the situation in Ukraine, and whether we see some reports in the media that there are voices in both countries making the case that they should develop their own nuclear weapons? I was wondering whether you had any views on that.
First of all, I wanted to say that Japan and ROK have joined other allies of the United States in the Asia Pacific, including Australia, also in supporting what's happening in sanctioning and in putting in place export controls against Russia. And I think that that has been very good, because it shows that this is not just a matter for Europe, but it is one that is a matter for Asia's security as well. And so I do want to applaud what's been going on. I have taken note of a number of commentators and experts in both Japan and the ROK speaking again about perhaps the importance of nuclear weapons. I believe basically that there will be horizontal escalation pressures coming out of this crisis, which is why I believe it's important. And it may surprise you, Alexander, but I believe it's very important for the NPT and the TPNW communities to be working very closely together at this juncture during this crisis to try to ensure that the multilateral constraints on nuclear weapons proliferation are both remaining in place, but also being strengthened going forward, because at the moment I do see pressures on horizontal escalation. I will also say, Tariq, however, that I took note, even when I was the undersecretary, which is now over 10 years ago for, well, actually I left in 2016, but where I saw these pressures emerging is over 10 years ago, when I began to see commentators increasingly in Seoul and some in Tokyo among certain political parties talking about the need to amend the constitution and move in the direction of acquiring indigenous nuclear weapons. So I just want to make the point that there have been some voices being raised for some period of time about this, but certainly in the current crisis, their voices are becoming louder.
Thank you, Rose. Alexander, well, we're coming to we'll have about 8 or 9 minutes left. So let me come back to you on the humanitarian, because there's also going to be a one-day conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons on the 20th of June in advance of the TPNW conference. So we've seen a lot of increased military activity by NATO forces and Russian forces at sea and at air, and we've had these older agreements of prevention of dangerous military activities on sea and in the air. Recently, there was a report that an Indian cruise missile flew 100 kilometers into Pakistan in the dead of night, and this was an accident. But these are two nuclear adversaries that share a border and have fought wars recently. So from this, do you see increasing dangers of inadvertent conflict that could escalate either into a nuclear conflict or otherwise be destabilizing, and therefore has implications for discussing these issues at the humanitarian implications conference that you're having on the 20th of June?
Thank you. Tariq, I just wanted to pick up what Rose has said before. I think it's a very good point. I hope that the way the first meeting of states parties of the TPNW unfolds, which has been prepared thus far in a very serious and very constructive way among the states parties, that some of the unfounded criticisms against the TPNW will fall away. And specifically in the current circumstances, is it a good thing or is it a bad thing if states are willing to invest into multilateralism and are willing to take on additional legally binding obligations, A, to support nuclear disarmament, but B, to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons? Because the TPNW is also, given the rationale on the humanitarian consequences and risks, is of course also a strong non-proliferation measure. So I hope that we will get into a more constructive water after the meeting of states parties, and probably also because what we see at the NPT. So it is important that states work very constructively on these issues. What Tariq has said, so there is the 3-day formal meeting of states parties of the TPNW, and on the day before, Austria is organizing a completely separate meeting, an expert conference on humanitarian consequences and risks, and it builds upon the 3 conferences on these issues that took place in 2013 and 2014, precisely to look at some of the new research on those issues. And there is some really interesting new research on the humanitarian consequences side. And there is, of course, a lot discussion which takes place in many contexts, including in the NPT, on risks and how to deal with these risks. And of course, as Tariq has pointed out, the risks of miscalculation, of inadvertent sliding into an escalation, human technical error, are some of the aspects that we looked at in great detail at this past conference, and we intend to look at the June 20 meeting once again. And of course, if there is this horizontal proliferation pressure that has been talked about by colleagues before, all these risks would rise exponentially. So these are very grave issues and concerns, and I would make the point that at some stage we may have a disagreement when, but at some stage, given what we know about the consequences and what we know about the risks, at some stage the calculus around nuclear deterrence must change. So if states that believe in the salience of nuclear weapons, then at least we should have a discussion. At what stage and with what level of information would these parameters start to change? Because I think it is an extremely important discussion that is not going to disappear. And I think the TPNW essentially also represents a call from a very large part of the international community to have this kind of engagement. So I hope that maybe the situation we see at the moment will lead for more constructive engagement of those that want to have it and wherever it's possible. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've now come to the end. So I'll give an opportunity to each of the 3 speakers for any final comments. Rose, I might note that when you were in office, you launched the International Partnership for Nuclear Disarmament Verification, IPDNV. And recently, the flagship of the Russian Navy, the Moskva, was sunk in the Black Sea. But in an earlier incarnation, it was the Soviet Navy ship called the Slava. And an important verification experiment took place in July 1989, actually done by civil society, the Academy of Sciences, and the Natural Resources Defense Council, where they tried to verify the presence of a nuclear warhead on the ship. So in your final comments, maybe you could just say a little bit about what are also the verification challenges if we go to a new follow-on treaty, whenever it is, that covers all nuclear warheads.
Absolutely, and I took note of the fact that the Moskva, then the Slava, was the ship that was taking part in that verification experiment in 1989. A very important, although ultimately inconclusive experiment, I believe.
Okay.
And it just went to show at that time how difficult it is to do remote monitoring to determine the absence or presence of warheads. We've come a long way since 1989. We have many more ubiquitous sensing systems. I think one of the reasons why although we're very concerned about nuclear saber battling in the Russian Federation and by the Kremlin leadership, in fact, we have a pretty good idea that there has not been an upward tick in the operational readiness of the Russian nuclear forces, both tactical or non-strategic and strategic, because in part of the excellent ubiquitous sensing capacity we now have in large constellations of commercial satellites. So in addition to the national technical means, of course. So a lot has changed since 1989, but the kind of fine-grained verification that will have to be done in order to ensure monitoring and verification of warheads is also very important. And I give a lot of praise to the IPNDV for the work that they have done in order to begin to get at some of those fine-grained problems. Exactly how, with inspectors on the ground, will we be able to monitor for the absence or presence of warheads, given the sensitivity of warhead data and the importance of shielding that sensitive data from getting out or being seen by the wrong people. So long story short, I think we've come a long way since 1989, and the IPNDV has played a really important role in that.
Thank you. Oliver, over to you. You also mentioned that you are the co-chair of the Trilateral Commission on Deep Cuts, and do you see any more life in that at some point, and in addition to your final comments?
Yes, I do. It's a short answer. As I said, I think these track 2 discussions can only become more important. They have played a very important role, not only in the good times, but particularly in the bad times in East-West relations. They can provide a safe space for discussing some of the ideas that Rose has put forward and others have put forward. It's a little bit different than what we hoped for. Our role would be pushing for deep cuts when we started in 2014, but 2013 actually. But it has, we now hope we can at least in the future be a forum for preparing the ground for these discussions. The problem, of course, is where we can meet, how we can discuss, how this will be supported. We are very grateful that the German Foreign Office has provided support for straight 8 years. That's very rare in this business, that there's such continuous support for such exercises. I think that's what we need, not only for the Deep Cuts Commission, but for such exercises more generally, to have such opportunities. Again, the level of ambition will be lower than what we hoped for when we embarked on this exercise, but the work that is being done is only the more valuable as we have less contacts officially, and negotiations, for example, in the Strategic Stability Dialogue become or remain very difficult, but we continue to make the case that the level of nuclear weapons that both sides have are far and beyond what would be needed for strategic stability. There are opportunities for reductions. The basis for that should be at least we can't extend New START again, but a continuation of the practices and limits that we have. But even beyond that, there are opportunities for reductions that should be seized. Maybe financial pressures at some point will play a positive role here, but certainly also we hope an awareness of the risks that are associated with nuclear weapons. That's something that we have continuously emphasized and will continue to highlight. So I think those are some of the issues that I hope we can tackle in the future. Thanks.
Thank you, Oliver. And finally, over to you, Alexander. As a small neutral country in the middle of Europe, Austria has played an important role with regard to the humanitarian implications of nuclear weapons. What more do you foresee for Austria here? And we discussed this in a different context, but some people are making the case that perhaps the Austrian model of neutrality, the Treaty of 1955, in some way could be a model for Ukraine in the future. And finally, Austrian Chancellor Karl Nehammer has been criticized in some quarters for his recent visit to Moscow to try and help with this situation. I was wondering whether you might have something to say on that as well. Thank you.
I think it's important to maintain dialogue, even though it's very difficult at the moment. So I think that was the motivation behind the visit of Chancellor Nehammer. He said his expectations weren't particularly high when he went there. In terms of the neutrality model, it's one of the aspects that's on the table that potentially may pave the way for a diplomatic outcome. But speaking in a personal capacity, I would say there is a very fundamental difference, because in 1955, when Austria decided adopted the neutrality law, it was supported very broadly by the population. It was the possibility to regain independence after having been on the wrong side of history, after having been occupied. So it was enthusiastically supported by the people of Austria, and to this day, it enjoys very, very broad support in Austria. In the case of Ukraine, I fear that it would be seen as imposed, and may still be a potential diplomatic way out. But in terms of how it is supported by the people of the country, I think there is a fundamental difference. In Austria, this has become a pivotal aspect of national identity. In Ukraine, I fear it would be different. That doesn't mean it may not be part of the solution to this issue, but I think it is an important aspect to bear in mind.
Thank you, Alexander. And now I will revert to Claudia Crawford of the Konrad-Adenauer Stiftung to thank our speakers and participants.
Thank you. And thank all of you for this very important, but especially very informative discussion. So thanks to Rose Gottemöller, Oliver Meyer, and to you, Ambassador Alexander Clement. I mean, even in the past years, arms control was a very difficult task. And now we see Russian aggression. It's almost not imaginable to have negotiations on these topics. It will take a long time to build up new trust. And this is important for having those negotiations. So, and from my side, I really would like to underline what Rose said right in the beginning. The top priority is getting the Russian forces out of Ukraine. I would like to give a special thanks to you, Tarek, for the moderation, brilliant as always, as usually. And I also like to thank the audience from around the world for the questions and comments you have made. We will continue with these online events because we see how important this exchange is. And you will hear from us in time for the next online briefing. Until then, all the best to you. And thank you again. Goodbye.
Thank you.